The Third Reich had a bomber that could reach New York, and you have heard almost nothing about it. This is no fable, no legend. The machine existed. It was built in almost 1,200 examples, and then, it seems, they agreed to fall silent about it. Why did a country that staked everything on this aircraft end up looking away from it so carefully? What exactly was hidden behind the curt lines of the reports? And is it true that its own crews at times feared this machine more than the enemy? Watch to the end. You will learn what fatal whim at the top turned the most ambitious bomber of the Reich into a trap for its own people, and why no one likes to speak of it aloud. This is the story of the Heinkel 177, known as the Greif. An opened file. A dangerous truth kept under lock and key for far too long. Let us start with the uncomfortable part. Germany was preparing for the wrong war. The entire military doctrine of the Reich rested on one audacious bet. The blow would be short, terrifying, and victorious. Lightning war, the Blitzkrieg, left no room for long years of grinding down an enemy's distant factories and cities. Why smash an opponent's industry thousands of kilometers away if armored wedges would cut the country apart in a matter of weeks? From that logic grew the role of air power. The Luftwaffe was conceived as flying artillery, as the long arm of the advancing armies. The aircraft was meant to clear the road for infantry and tanks, to crush signal junctions, tear up railway stations, and hammer airfields and columns on the march. The dive bomber, its siren screaming over the heads of the defenders, became the very symbol of this philosophy. Tactics, the front, the near rear, and not a single step beyond. A strategic bomber simply did not fit into this scheme. A heavy, expensive, fuel-hungry machine that spends months flying deep into enemy territory and slowly grinding away at its economy is an instrument of a long war of attrition. Precisely the war the Reich did not intend to fight and, as history would show, did not know how to fight. An expensive toy for a conflict that no one at the top believed in. And yet, the heavy aircraft was not buried for good. Strategic aviation had its own powerful patron, the chief of the Luftwaffe General Staff, General Walter Wever, a man who firmly understood that the coming war might turn out to be nothing like as short as they dreamed in Berlin. Under his hand, work went forward on heavy four-engined machines, the very ones later called the Ural bombers, aircraft able to reach into the industrial depths of a possible Eastern opponent. Then it all collapsed in an instant. In the middle of the 1930s, Wever was lost in an aviation accident, and with him the heavy bomber program lost its chief defender. Is it any surprise that, without him, the Ural projects were quickly scrapped as a needless luxury? The bet was placed once and for all on tactics, on blitzkrieg, on a mass of medium machines. The idea of a great strategic fist was filed away indefinitely. But they did not quite dare to abandon the heavy bomber altogether. Like any great power, Germany had no wish to be left entirely without a trump card of this class. And so, in the very middle of the 30s, a technical requirement was born under the code name Bomber A, a specification that sketched out the future giant of the Luftwaffe. On paper, the demands sounded almost fantastic for the time. The future machine was required to carry no less than 1 ton of bombs and to deliver that load over a range of no less than 6,000 kilometers. 6,000! A distance that spanned half a continent and led far beyond the familiar horizons of the front. High speed, a serious payload by the standards of the day, an enormous radius of action. The requirement read like a claim staked on a weapon of an entirely different order than the usual frontline workhorses. And right here, in these dry lines of the specification, a time bomb was already ticking. Among the perfectly reasonable demands, one was hidden that would cancel out everything else, a single condition that turned an ambitious project into years of disaster. But more on that a little later. And now to the very condition this whole conversation was leading up to. Among the sensible points of the specification, one demand stood apart, the kind that ran a chill through any sober engineer. A heavy strategic bomber, a many-ton giant with an enormous wingspan, was required to be capable of striking from a dive. Not to approach smoothly and release its load on a level run, as a machine of its class was meant to, but to plunge downward like a battlefield dive bomber. Consider the absurdity of the idea. Dive bombing was invented for light and compact machines, for the likes of the Junkers 87, which dropped onto its target almost vertically and pulled out of the attack under monstrous loads. For a small aircraft, that is tolerable. But when a heavy bomber is thrown into a steep dive, its airframe takes on stresses that a structure of such size is simply not built to withstand. Wing, fuselage, tail surfaces, all of it begins to work on the edge of failure. Let me say it straight away, getting ahead of the story. The Greif was never destined to become the world's first dive-bombing strategic bomber, nor could it ever have been. It was a chimera, a chase after the impossible, an attempt to make an ocean liner perform the pirouettes of a racing speedboat. And still the demand was kept in force, and the designers had to submit to it. Who on earth dreamed this up? Are decisions like this truly made by people so far removed from real engineering? Behind this nonsense, it is customary to see the figure of Ernst Udet, the celebrated ace of the First Great War, a darling of the public, a masterful pilot. Yet a brilliant flyer and a competent director of aircraft programs are very far from the same thing. It was precisely through such enthusiasts that the dive-bombing idea spread across every design bureau of the Reich like an obsessive fashion. Or perhaps the matter does not end with Udet. It is hard to believe that a project of this scale escaped a heavy hand from above. The Luftwaffe clung to a plainly ridiculous condition far too stubbornly, refused for far too long to drop it against every argument the engineers could muster. And the thought creeps in of its own accord. Did the ever-present Führer himself have a hand in this scheme? A man who adored meddling in matters he understood far less than he imagined. However it was, the reckoning came at once, and that reckoning was measured in the most precious resource of any war: time. Airframes that were nearly finished had to be broken apart and recut from scratch. Strengthen the structure, add weight, rework the joints, build in a margin of strength for loads that a normal bomber should never have to face. The aircraft grew heavier before everyone's eyes, thickened, lost its elegance and gained mass, all for a trick it did not need in the first place. And here is the result of this race after the unreachable. Precious months, in truth precious years, were squandered for nothing. For its potential finest hour, for the Battle of Britain, when a heavy long-range bomber might truly have had a weighty word to say over the cities of England, the Greif simply did not arrive in time. The machine stayed raw, unfinished, and acutely unreliable, a half-completed giant that was late for its own war. Let us turn away from the administrative madness and look at the aircraft itself. And there was plenty to look at. Under the pencil of Siegfried Günther, one of the most gifted designers of the Reich, a machine of rare, almost defiant beauty was taking shape. A smooth, elongated fuselage, flowing contours, not a single needless edge. The Greif looked swift, even standing still on the apron. Looking at those lines, it was hard to believe you were facing the future nightmare of crews and factories. Günther chose a mid-wing layout. The wing passed roughly through the middle of the fuselage, leaving a deep and roomy bay for the bomb load. The tail was crowned by a single tall fin, a clean and concise solution, without the bulky twin tail that so many heavy machines of the era flaunted. Everything in the aircraft's appearance breathed a striving for minimum drag, for speed, for aerodynamic perfection. Engineering thought was working at full stretch here, and working brilliantly. But the true breakthrough was hidden not in the contours, but in the defensive system. And here the Heinkel designers achieved something that placed the Greif among the most advanced machines of its time. They fitted the bomber with remotely controlled gun positions, among the first in the practice of world aircraft building. It sounds ordinary, yet behind those words lay a small revolution. Picture how the defense of a heavy bomber usually looked. The gunner sits right inside the turret, pressed against his machine guns, in a piercing wind, under an icy sky, exposed to splinters and bullets, heaving the heavy weapon with his own hands. On the Greif, that picture was turned upside down. Now the gunner-operator sat in a relatively protected spot and aimed nothing more than the crosshairs of a sight onto the target. From there, a cunning mechanism took over. Commands from the sight were passed through a system of shafts and geared drives, and those obediently swung the barbette and turret in step with the operator's movement. The man took aim, the iron turned the barrels. A union of precise mechanics and well-thought-out kinematics replaced the raw muscle power of a gunner left open to every wind. For the late 1930s, this was a genuinely bold piece of engineering, well ahead of its age. The benefit of such a solution proved twofold, and both sides of the coin were good. First, the defensive armament could be packaged with extreme compactness. Bulky manned turrets no longer bulged out of the contours, no longer broke the aerodynamics, no longer dragged along needless resistance. The aircraft kept its clean, fast lines even when bristling with barrels. Second, the saving in space and mass was put straight to work. The freed-up weight the designers spent not on decoration, but on strengthening the protection of the gun positions themselves and of the machine's vital nodes. Less open metal exposed to fire, the gunners more securely covered, the armor packed tighter exactly where it was needed most. On paper, the result was an ideal aerial fighter, handsome, fast, soundly protected. Ideal until the conversation turned to what was hiding inside its engine nacelles. And now we have reached the fatal fork, the decision that shaped the entire destiny of the machine. The turning point in the history of the Greif was the choice of power plant. It was here that a brilliant design veered into the abyss, and it veered there not by accident. It was steered that way deliberately, head held high. In the late 1930s, the aviation world was all but feverish over liquid-cooled engines. Their inline, elongated blocks allowed a thin, narrow cowling, and that meant less frontal drag and more speed. These engines were crammed into almost every promising prototype, and Germany, one of the acknowledged leaders of world aircraft building, wished once again to astonish everyone with something special. Not merely good, but unheard of. And the Germans came up with it. Instead of the usual 4 separate engines on the wing, the decision was taken to fit only 2 nacelles. But what nacelles they were! Each concealed not a single power unit, but an entire coupled installation. 2 engines joined into one block and turning a single propeller through a common gearbox. So the coupled systems were born, first the DB606, which was a pair of DB601 engines, and later the more powerful DB610, based on the DB605. Each engine in the pair kept its own cooling system, and the design even allowed one of the 2 units to be shut down in flight. In theory, the picture was mesmerizing. From each such coupling, one could draw power that was colossal for the day, on the order of 3,000 horsepower. 2 nacelles instead of 4 meant a cleaner wing, less drag, better aerodynamics. Space was freed beneath the wing, and with it, the chance to fit a propeller of greater diameter, biting extra knots of speed out of the air. On paper, brilliant. 1 engine doing the work of 2, the machine keeping the look of an elegant twin while wielding the muscle of a 4-engined giant. The designers admired this elegant formula. The military rubbed their hands. It seemed the key to the dream aircraft had been found. It seemed. Because in practice, everything turned out quite differently. The coupled installation proved capricious, unreliable, and deadly. Two engines forced into one cramped nacelle, packed almost flush together, ran so hot that unthinkable temperatures built up inside. Oil and fuel pooled between the blocks, and the white-hot exhaust pipes turned that mixture into ready kindling. A single spark was enough, and the nacelle flared up right there in the air. Failures ceased to be a matter of chance and became a matter of law. The engines choked, seized, and caught fire, and not one at a time, but at times both at once, robbing the machine of thrust along an entire side. What had been conceived as the heart of a breakthrough aircraft turned into a constant menace to everyone who took the Greif aloft. The reckoning did not keep them waiting, and it was a fearful one. In test flights, fires and failures of the coupled installations wiped out 3 prototypes. 3 costly, carefully assembled machines lost, and lost far from empty. With them ended the fates of the test crews, men who had trusted in a cunning engineering formula. This was the first bloody entry in the long account that the Greif was only just beginning to present to its creators. You would think that after all this, any reasonable person would slam on the brakes. Prototypes burning, crews lost, the coupled installation behaving like a time bomb. It was exactly the moment to stop, take a breath, and bring the machine up to standard. But this did not stop the military. It did not trouble them. It did not give them pause for so much as a second. Instead of a halt, a large order was placed for serial production of an aircraft that could barely fly. The plans astonished with a scope worthy of a far sounder idea. Serial output was to be driven up to 120 machines a month, a stream fit for a proven, reliable, fully tested bomber. And to reach that tempo, the leadership took a step almost criminal in its carelessness. Production of the Heinkel 111 was halted altogether, a workhorse that was dependable, mastered, and now declared obsolete. Allied plants were closed and hurriedly retooled for the new favorite. Think about that logic. A proven machine that flew and fought without fault is tossed onto the scrap heap of history for the sake of a raw, burning giant that no one had properly tested. The bet is placed blind, on the word of the designers and on sheer ambition. And that bet was about to be called in, with interest. The reckoning arrived together with the first production Greifs. If during testing the troubles could still be written off as growing pains, now the disaster took on the character of total catastrophe. The machines rolling off the line proved to be not a weapon, but a lethal trap for their own crews. In ordinary level flight, without any dive, without overloads or sharp maneuvers, fires broke out and ruinous engine failures occurred. And the moment a pilot so much as dipped the nose marked the most cautious descent, the structure gave way. The machines did not merely fail. They broke apart right there in the air, scattering in pieces over the ranges and airfields. The giant the command had prayed for behaved as if it had been built to break the lives of everyone who came near it. The production Greif turned out to be more dangerous to its own side than to any enemy. And here came the bitter awakening. The hastily buried Heinkel 111 was suddenly needed again, and needed desperately. That very obsolete laborer, so carelessly cast aside, remained the only thing that actually flew and fought. Production of the old machine had to be rebuilt from scratch, and again at colossal expense, setting up the tooling once more, spinning the lines back up, making up for lost ground. For its arrogance toward proven hardware, the Reich paid twice. And the fate of the Greif itself crashed from dizzying heights into the deepest pit. From a grand 120 machines a month, output had to be cut to 3 miserable units. 3 aircraft instead of 120. There is the true price of ambition multiplied by stubbornness. A program conceived as the backbone of the Reich's strategic might in fact became a black hole down which factories, metal, fuel, and men drained away. And the most frightening part was that this was still far from the last chapter in its record of misfortunes. By the autumn of 1941, patience was running thin even among the most stubborn. The endless procession of fires, failures, and breakups in the air finally led to the thought that sensible engineers had voiced from the very start. If the coupled installation behaves like an outright curse, is it not time to return to the simple, proven classic layout? To 4 separate engines on the wing, each with its own propeller, without cunning gearboxes and cramped, red-hot nacelles. The idea was painfully obvious. For the engines, they chose the same reliable DB603, but now in an honest, single arrangement. 1 engine, 1 propeller, 1 straightforward nacelle, proper access for maintenance. No mystique, no twinned blocks hoarding heat and oil until the first spark. Simply 4 hearts in place of 2 overheated monsters. A solution that would have spared both the machines and the men had it been spoken aloud a couple of years earlier. But here big bureaucratic politics stepped onto the stage, and common sense ran into a wall once more. The construction of the 4-engined prototypes was held back by Hermann Göring himself. The all-powerful commander of the Luftwaffe considered such a layout obsolete, yesterday's thinking, a step back from the progressive coupled systems. The paradox was cruel. The burning, murderous installation counted as advanced, while the life-saving classic was branded backward. The personal tastes and obstinacy of one man outweighed the bloody statistics of the trials. The matter jammed solid, and only the heaviest lever available could shift it: the personal intervention of the Führer. Only after a direct order from the very top did the stalled project finally move. There you have the whole worth of engineering logic in the Reich. To put normal engines on a bomber, an order from the head of state was required. Not calculations, not the testers' reports, not the coffins of crews, but the whim and counter-whim of the leaders. In 1943, the matter reached metal. 2 aircraft of the new 4-engine variety were built with a reworked tail. Flight testing of these machines unfolded around the turn of 1943 into 44, and the result proved gratifying. The figures pleased. 4 honest engines behaved incomparably more calmly than the hellish coupled systems. The aircraft received its own designation, the Heinkel 177B. It seemed the way out had been found, however unforgivably late. In the spring of 1944, Göring grudgingly gave his consent to serial production, and the plans, as is the custom in this story, once again displayed a truly cosmic scope. The talk was of 200 machines a month, 200 bombers every month, as if there had been no preceding string of failures and empty promises at all. The command's flights of fancy remained inexhaustible, whatever was happening around them, and around them the harsh reality was unfolding, and it had no wish to reckon with fantasy. The sky over the Reich was already being buried in bombs by enemy armadas, and however desperately the German leadership dreamed of dealing comparable blows of reprisal, the country simply lacked the strength for it. What the country needed was something quite different: fighters, desperately and at once, to give its own cities and factories at least some cover. A heavy long-range bomber looked in this picture like an unaffordable luxury, and here is the natural finale of the whole undertaking. The first production batch of 8 machines was followed by precisely nothing: 8 aircraft and a dead end. The long-awaited, sensible, life-saving 4-engined variant appeared at the very moment when there was neither means nor reason to build large bombers. Yet another brilliant idea was late by exactly enough to mean nothing whatsoever. The history of the Greif is full of forks at which the machine might have turned toward an entirely different fate. And one of the most tantalizing of those forks is the high-altitude variant, which remained a beautiful ghost on paper. The notion stirred the imagination. Take the airframe of a heavy bomber, extend its wing, make it longer and thinner, and lift the machine up to where simply no one could reach it. The logic was flawless, and all the more vexing for it. A long wing of greater span grips the thin air of swelling altitudes far more surely than an ordinary one. Paired with high-altitude engines built to work in the cold, oxygen-poor stratosphere, such an aircraft could climb to marks beyond the reach of the bulk of machines of that era. And here begins the most enticing part. Picture a long-range scout and bomber cruising at a height of more than 14 kilometers. More than 14. At such marks, the air will barely hold the wing of an ordinary fighter. Engines gasp, pilots languish in the meager atmosphere. The interceptors of the time simply could not reach up there, running out of breath far below. Anti-aircraft artillery lost a target like that in the unreachable heights, and the shells burst somewhere far down, never touching the ghost. The result would have been an invisible aircraft of a special kind, untouchable not through cunning camouflage, but through sheer, naked altitude. It could have drifted calmly over enemy territory, photographing airfields, factories, and ports, hunting out targets, all while staying beyond the reach of every defensive means of the day. A distant eye and a distant arm of the Reich, soaring in the stratosphere where neither fighter nor flak could climb. On paper, the dream of any staff. The notion was serious enough to spill over into a separate branch of development, in essence, already a new machine with a face of its own. An aircraft with markedly altered geometry, with a different wing, aimed squarely at the conquest of great heights. This was no longer a mere refinement of the Greif, but a step toward a specialized high-altitude giant born for the stratosphere. But let us be honest to the end. All of this is poetry. A handsome conditional mood, a game of what would have happened if. The reality of the wartime Reich left no room for such refined projects. Time slipped through the fingers, resources melted away, factories choked under the bombs, and the front demanded not stratospheric dreams, but simple, plain, immediately needed machines. And so the stratospheric hunter remained a drawing, a calculation, a handful of bold ideas. Now we know for certain, aircraft of this kind were not built in series. Yet another of the Greif's potentials was outlined, sketched, almost tangible, and once again abandoned halfway. The ghost of the untouchable scout dissolved without leaving a trace in the real sky of the war, and we are left only to wonder what it might have become had anyone carried it through to metal. And now let us set aside the beautiful mirages of the high-altitude projects and return to the very machine that actually went into series, the variant with the coupled engines. To that same burning monster, the command stubbornly dragged into the sky against all common sense. Because it is precisely here, in the struggle with this red-hot nightmare, that the real engineering drama of the Greif played out. In 1941 and 1942, a colossal, almost desperate effort unfolded around the cursed power plant. Under the guidance of the engineers, the coupled unit began to be dissected down to the very sinews, hunting out every reason it flared up in the air. Not cosmetic repair, not patching holes in haste, but a deep, painstaking opening up of every weak point. The engineers sought not a culprit but the root of the trouble, and they sought it doggedly, node by node. The scale of that hunt is impressive even today. In the course of the work, 56 possible sources of fire were found and eliminated. 56, more than 100 separate ways the installation could let the crew down and turn into a torch. Each of them had to be reckoned out, understood, and closed off. Reroute the lines, redesign the drainage, lead the scorching exhaust farther away, separate oil and fuel from the sources of heat. This was not a flash of genius but heavy, methodical, grinding labor. And in the end, that labor bore fruit. The coupled unit was tamed. The installation that not long before had turned every flight into a game of Russian roulette gradually became fit for the job. In this long bout, the German engine men came out on top, slowly, painfully, but honestly wresting from the structure its lethal habits, a purely engineering victory that, under other circumstances, would have deserved to be written in letters of gold. The trouble is that the price and the timing of this victory turned the triumph into a bitter mockery. Truly combat-worthy machines, ones that could finally be trusted, began reaching the line units only in 1943. Only then did the Greif at last cease to be, first and foremost, a threat to its own crew. Splendid, you would think, but you need only recall when this whole saga began for the joy to stick in your throat. For serial production of the Greif had started back in 1939. Take in that abyss. 4 long years between the start of production and the appearance of machines one could rely on. For 4 years, the line dutifully turned out aircraft, and they could not be trusted. For 4 years, the factories worked, the metal was spent, the crews took the controls, and what came out was a half-finished product ready to fail at any moment. And here's the figure in which all the senselessness of this story comes together. Over those lost years, more than 500 machines were built, 500 and more aircraft that were, by and large, useless and not seldom plainly dangerous. 500 costly, complex, fuel-hungry craft that swallowed a vast amount of labor and resources before the Greif even learned not to let its own people down. A whole air fleet squandered on the road to a reliability that should have been secured from the very start. And then came the hour when the Greif was at last to prove itself in real action. The combat debut of the heavy bomber fell on one of the most terrible pages of the entire war, the Battle of Stalingrad. The machines were gathered into a separate bomber group, and it was this group that first led the Greifs into the sky over the frozen steppe of the Don. A debut meant to be a finest hour turned into something else entirely. The task set before the crews sounded, in its way, both noble and desperate. A vast German force had been clamped fast inside a ring of Soviet troops, cut off from its own side, bled white, and doomed to hunger and cold. The heavy Greifs were to serve as an air bridge, carrying supplies to the encircled troops, all the things without which an army in a pocket becomes a frostbitten, starving crowd. The long-range bomber was suddenly reforged into a transport of desperation. But which machines exactly were thrown into this meat grinder? Aircraft of the early series, of that very batch in which the coupled engines had not yet passed their saving refinement. Those same raw, capricious, fire-prone installations, the taming of which still lay many long months of stubborn engineering struggle away. In essence, the hardware sent into the sky over Stalingrad was the very hardware its own makers were at that moment feverishly trying to make safe. A knowingly unreliable instrument in a knowingly hopeless situation. The result proved natural, and for that twice as hard to bear. In the course of 43 combat sorties, the group lost 7 machines. 7 heavy bombers gone in the frozen sky over little more than half 100 sorties is a ruinous tally by any measure. Costly, complex, hard-won aircraft dropped out one after another, and each such loss told painfully on the already meager forces of the Luftwaffe in this sector. But the most staggering part lies not in the number of losses, but in their cause. Not one of those 7 aircraft was brought down by an enemy fighter. Not one fell to the accurate fire of anti-aircraft artillery. Every single one of them fell victim to its own mechanical troubles, to failures, breakdowns, the same congenital ills of the cursed power plant. The enemy here had almost nothing to do with it. The Greif dealt with itself, without any help from outside. Take that picture in properly. A bomber created to wage war in its very first serious test was smashing not the enemy, but itself. Not Soviet pilots, not the flak crews, but red-hot nacelles, capricious engines, and fragile joints were striking the Greifs from the rolls, one after another. The machine lost the fight before it even met the enemy, lost it to its own construction. There you have the whole triumph of the combat debut, a word applicable to this story only in the most caustic of quotation marks. A loudly conceived entrance onto the stage turned into a quiet, joyless failure, paid for in hardware and crews for nothing. The long-range bomber of the Reich began its combat biography not with a resounding victory, but with a plain, indisputable proof of its own unreliability. While the engineers, by the sweat of their brow, were cleaning cause after cause out of the engines, the Greif suddenly found a new and unexpected calling. Alongside the fight for a reliable engine, it was decided to adapt the machine for a quite particular load, for guided gliding bombs. And here, strange as it sounds, a knowingly dubious bomber suddenly felt out a role in which its shortcomings receded into the background. The weapon for which this conversion was undertaken was genuinely advanced for its time. The guided gliding bomb HS-293, once released from its rack, did not simply fall along a ballistic arc like an ordinary munition. It flew toward the target on the operator's command, who steered it by its smoke trail, correcting the course straight from aboard the carrier aircraft. In essence, it was an early precision weapon, a guided projectile aimed first and foremost at the enemy's ships, and for the war at sea it promised serious trouble. The combat trial of this pairing took place on the 21st of November, 1943. A group of 25 heavy bombers was sent up, and each carried 2 guided gliding bombs beneath its wings. The target was an Allied convoy, and the design was audacious: to cover the transports with guided weapons from a distance beyond the reach of the ship's anti-aircraft guns. On paper, a perfect hunt. In fact, everything went far less smoothly. The elements themselves and the obstinacy of the defenders got in the way. Low, dense cloud wrapped the sea and cut visibility, robbing the operators of precious seconds for guidance. And from the decks, there rose to meet the aircraft a thick, furious barrier of shipboard anti-aircraft fire, throwing off the aim and setting the crews on edge. In such conditions, steering the fragile flight of a gliding bomb was agonizingly hard, and the accuracy of the sortie slumped sharply. The outcome of the attack proved vexingly modest. Of the many guided bombs launched, only 2 found their mark. 1 transport was sent to the bottom, and 1 more was badly damaged. A meager harvest for 25 heavy machines, each bearing a pair of costly guided projectiles. A formidable armada with breakthrough weaponry aboard achieved a result that would barely fill a curt line in a report. And then, in the sky above the convoy, a scene played out worthy of a legend of its own. A lone patrol aircraft of Coastal Command, a 4-engined Liberator, spotted the approaching German bombers and did not think to turn aside. One against an entire group of heavy machines, it boldly threw itself into the attack and, with the fire of its onboard guns, damaged 2 Greifs at once. 1 daring crew hurling itself at the pack, and 2 of its members left limping, an image in which the zeal and courage of a single crew cancel out the numerical advantage of the foe. All told, the picture of the sortie came out joyless however you reckon it. Yes, 1 enemy transport went under, and formally the target was struck. But the price of that success proved out of all proportion. For various reasons, in the course of the operation, the group lost 3 machines, and 4 more were damaged. 3 lost, and 4 crippled bombers for a single ship sent down. That is an exchange no one could call a success, however much they wished to. And yet, there was one episode in this cheerless naval chronicle when the Greif, with its guided weapon, worked with merciless, terrible precision. The heavy bomber showed its highest combat result on the 26th of November, 1943, only a few days after the failed hunt for the convoy. And that success wrote the machine forever into one of the darkest pages of the war at sea. That day, the operator's sight fell upon a large troop transport, the British ship Rona, converted from a passenger liner to carry soldiers. Under her flag, in her cramped holds and on her decks, were not Britons but American servicemen, being ferried across the Mediterranean toward their destination. Packed to the brim, shoulder to shoulder, more than 1,000 men had gathered aboard, a whole military formation compressed into a steel box in the middle of open water. A single guided gliding bomb, launched from a Greif, found its target with deadly accuracy. A direct hit pierced the hull and brought catastrophic destruction down upon the ship. That very advanced weapon, which days earlier had shown so pale over the clouded convoy, now worked at full, monstrous strength. The great transport, crammed with people, was doomed within minutes. A breach, fire, a list that swelled with frightening speed, and then began what turned a military loss into a true catastrophe. The rescue operation, on which hundreds of lives depended, unfolded in the most unfavorable conditions one could possibly imagine. The sea met those going down with darkness and heavy swell. Ponderous rollers flung the boats and rafts about, the icy water drained away strength, and the night hid the rescued and the rescuers from one another. In that pitch-black jumble of gloom, waves, and panic, any organized aid crumbled before one's eyes. The lowered life-saving craft were overturned and scattered. People were thrown about the churning water, and the escort ships, with enormous difficulty, snatched only a portion of those in distress out of the dark. Chaos in which even the desperate bravery of the rescuers could reach far from everyone. The result of that night was staggering in its weight. The overwhelming majority of those aboard never returned home. The losses ran into hundreds of men, and by the number of lives it carried off, this episode became one of the heaviest naval tragedies to befall American troops in the entire war. A single accurate launch from a Greif brought about the loss of a whole military formation. And here lies the darkest paradox of this whole story. The machine that smashed itself over Stalingrad and burned through resources fruitlessly for years, suddenly, in the role of a carrier of guided weapons, showed what it was truly capable of. It was in precisely this capacity, as a naval hunter with a precision projectile beneath its wing, that the Greif was then used right up to the very end of the war. Its finest hour, the doomed program found not in proud strategic raids, but in a quiet, pitiless hunt for ships. As a naval hunter, the Greif had shown its worth, but the Reich had intended it for something quite different, for the role of a true strategic bomber able to bring down reprisal upon the enemy's capitals, and such an entrance onto the stage did take place. The machine received its true bomber's baptism in the course of Operation Steinbock, a series of night strikes against the British capital, meant to answer, however feebly, the mounting wave of raids on German cities. The chosen aim was night strikes against London, and it was in the darkness that the crews of the Greifs unfolded a tactic so inventive that it deserves a tale of its own. Every step of this nocturnal ritual was thought through to wring the maximum out of an imperfect machine, while, as far as possible, deceiving the enemy's defense. It all began still on the ground, at the forward airfield by the Rhine, long before they appeared over the target. The takeoff was staged with almost theatrical precision. On the tail of each bomber, a special light glowed, a signal flame visible to the crews following behind. A machine would roll into its run, lift from the strip, and only when the agreed sign for runway clear flared ahead would the next Greif begin its run. So, in the pitch of night, without crowding or collisions, the heavy bombers went up one after another, forming an unseen queue bound for London. Next came cunning against the radars. Having drawn off about 50 kilometers from the shore, the crews began to drop strips of light reflective foil. These weightless ribbons flared on the radar screens as false marks, clogging the picture with interference and hiding the true machines within a swarm of phantom targets. The drop was repeated again and again, methodically sowing the night sky with shimmering litter and throwing the operators of the British defense into confusion. But the most audacious trick was held back for the approach to the target itself. Over the British capital, the pilots hushed their engines and eased the machines into a shallow gliding descent, stealing almost soundlessly toward the release point. In this way, they sought to deceive the sound tracking services that caught the foe by the drone of engines in the night. A quieted, gliding bomber sounded nothing like a machine roaring at full throttle. Down with the bombs went the last portion of reflective foil as well, finishing off an already disordered picture of the defense, and then a swift, calculated withdrawal. Freed of their load, the Greifs went on losing height, accelerating to 560 kilometers an hour, wringing everything out of the airframe just to break away from the enemy's night fighters. They reached the French shore already down by the water, at a height of only about 800 meters, and from there slid homeward along a specially laid air corridor by the strait, changing course at an agreed point and returning to their airfield by the Rhine. These strikes were delivered systematically, night after night, over the span of several months. And here lies a curious result. The direct material damage from the raids proved, frankly, modest. No real reprisal comparable to what the German cities were enduring came of it. What these nocturnal visits did lay bare, with full clarity, was something else. Despite serious resources, the British night defense was simply not ready for such guests. The bold, slippery Greifs passed through it time and again, and the defenders, on those nights, could find nothing truly effective to set against them. The night visits to London were not the last chapter in the combat biography of the Greif. In 1944, the heavy bomber appeared in the east as well, on the vast, all-grinding front against the Soviet Union. There a bomber formation was raised, bearing the resounding name Hindenburg, and armed with these very machines. The unit began its combat sorties in early summer, and here the Germans chose a tactic quite unlike the audacious night raids on the British capital. In the east, the Greifs worked from great heights, and in this lay a cold calculation. Climbing higher, the heavy machines became all but unreachable for the Soviet fighters of that period, which found it hard to claw up to a bomber at such a mark and force a fight upon it. As a result, the formation operated in relative safety, taking almost no losses to enemy aviation. From the standpoint of preserving costly machines and trained crews, it was a reasonable and cautious choice. The scope of individual operations was impressive. On the 16th of June 1944, 87 bombers were raised into the air all at once for a strike on the Soviet rear area town of Velikiye Luki. Nearly 90 heavy machines in a single raid is no longer a matter of scattered sorties, but a true aerial armada, the very strategic force for whose sake the whole project had once been undertaken. They bombed other targets deep behind the front as well, Pskov, Smolensk, and other hubs in the enemy's rear. But behind the imposing picture hid the same bitter truth. Bombing from great height, so safe for the crews themselves, proved an all but useless occupation. From a height of many kilometers, the load fell wide, the scatter came out enormous, and the chance of actually striking an important target melted away before one's eyes. Dozens of heavy machines rose into the sky, spent their bombs, fuel, and engine life, and on the ground, the effect of their efforts came out vexingly modest. Safe for one's own side, but almost in vain for the cause. And then the situation on the ground turned sharply, and there was no more time for high-altitude raids. When the Soviet forces launched their powerful offensive in Belorussia, the front rolled westward, sweeping away the German defense. In this collapsing situation, the heavy bombers of the Hindenburg were ever more often pulled from their usual work and thrown against the advancing Soviet tank columns. A strategic instrument, born to strike at factories and cities, turned into a fire brigade hurriedly plugging the breaches in a crumbling front. To use a heavy long-range bomber as a ground attack machine against tanks is, in itself, a verdict on the whole conception. A costly, complex machine, created for distant raids deep into enemy territory, was now patching tactical holes right at the line of contact, where its value swiftly depreciated. Of the proud strategic plans, not a trace remained, only a desperate attempt to hold back, by any means, the onrushing wave. And here came the finale, ordinary, and for that very reason, especially telling. By September of 1944, the bomber aviation of the Reich was simply left without fuel. Not enemy fighters, not the flak, not the maneuvers of the foe put an end to this story, but empty tanks and exhausted stores of fuel. The formidable Greifs, which had survived engine fires, refinements, and redeployments, stood frozen on their airfields, not from an enemy blow, but from an elementary lack of gasoline. A quiet, inglorious halt that became a mirror of the whole twilight of the Reich. The story of the Greif also held a thoroughly exotic turn, as if it had stepped off the pages of an adventure novel. In one of the last modifications of the machine, the A7 variant, a lively interest was suddenly shown by the Reich's allies on the other side of the planet, the Japanese. The distant island empire, waging its own heavy war in the Pacific, was eyeing the German heavy bomber in earnest. The Japanese were drawn to more than merely admiring someone else's machine. They wished to set up its licensed production at home, to build Greifs with their own hands, in their own factories, for their own needs. The idea was logical in its way. A long-range heavy bomber with a wide radius of action would have come in extremely handy across the boundless expanses of the Pacific, where distances were measured not in hundreds, but in thousands of kilometers of open water. But before building it, the machine had at least to be delivered to the far end of Eurasia, and here a truly audacious plan was born. The prototype aircraft was to be flown to Japan under its own power, in a single non-stop flight. The route was striking in its sheer daring. To rise from East Prussia, pass in one enormous bound over the entire territory of the Soviet Union, and come down already in Manchuria, on land under Japanese control. Take that scheme in properly. A German bomber was to cross by air, alone and without a single landing, the whole boundless country with which the Reich was waging the bloodiest war of its history. A flight over the heads of the enemy, through his airspace, past his airfields and observation posts, at great height and colossal range. Pure adventure, mixed from that very blend of engineering daring and reality-detached grandstanding that had accompanied the Greif from the drawing board itself. And in this audacious scheme is the whole character of the machine, as in a single drop of water. The same scope, the same craving for the impossible, the same wager on a spectacular breakthrough against sober calculation. The Greif was once again preparing to astonish the world with something unheard of, this time a transcontinental dash across half the globe. On paper, it sounded almost majestic. On paper, everything about this machine always sounded splendid. Yet reality once again proved stronger than any bold plans. The situation at the fronts was changing swiftly and inexorably, and changing not at all in the Reich's favor. The Soviet forces were advancing, the ring around Germany was tightening. The old calculations crumbled faster than the ink could dry on the staff maps. In that collapse of time and space, there was simply no room left for handsome adventures. So the swiftly crumbling front buried this audacious plan as well, quietly, without a single shot fired at the project itself. The Japanese Greif did not take off. The Trans-Eurasian flight never took place. The licensed factories on the islands remained a fantasy to the end. Yet another vivid idea bound up with this machine repeated the fate of all the rest. It flared, beckoned with the impossible, and went out, leaving no trace beyond a line in the register of schemes that never came to be. So ingloriously did the fate of one of the most unusual aircraft of its age come to an end. By the intent of its chief designer, the Greif was to become a truly progressive machine, a breakthrough, stuffed with a whole heap of bold innovations. And here is the cruel irony. The machine did indeed become exactly that, a collection of advanced ideas. Only those ideas turned out to hail from two completely different worlds. Some of the innovations you can easily file even today, under sensible, practical, ahead of their time. First among them, of course, is the onboard remotely controlled armament, that very solution which spared the gunner the icy wind of an open turret and let him train the barrels with a light movement of the sight. Here the designer's thought strode far ahead, and there is simply no arguing with how right it was. This was engineering that aviation would have arrived at sooner or later anyway. The other innovations, however, you cannot call anything but tyranny. And chief among them is that same dull, unreasoning stubbornness with which the high command clung, year after year, to a complex, capricious, deadly power plant. How many prototypes were lost? How many crews did not return from test flights? How many factories ran a fever? And still the decision was kept in force against the obvious. It is not the mistake itself that astonishes. Everyone makes mistakes. What astonishes is the mulish persistence with which they held to it. In fairness, let us say it plainly. In this long, grinding bout, the German engine men did, in the end, come out on top. The coupled unit was tamed, the causes of the fires cleaned out one after another, and by the twilight of the war, the machine at last became what it should have been from the very start, reliable. A clean, honest engineering victory. Only it arrived so late and at such a price that there is simply no one and no reason to celebrate it. Because at the strategic level, from all this floundering, failure, and belated triumph, precisely one side gained, and that side was across the line of the front. Every month the Reich spent taming burning engines, every factory switched to producing a raw giant, every ton of metal and fuel that went into this bottomless pit, all of it worked not for Germany, but against it. The Allies had only to rejoice in silence, watching their opponent sink, with his own hands, a vast store of resources into one single troubled project. And here it is high time to return to where we began, to the simple and uncomfortable question. Is it really sensible, in conditions of total war into which the Reich had thrown itself wholly and without remainder, to pour so much strength into an aircraft so complex, so costly, and simply so unsafe? In a war of attrition, where every liter of fuel, every machine tool, and every trained man counts, such a luxury borders no longer on the daring of a pioneer, but on outright wastefulness. And in this, perhaps, lies the chief lesson of the Greif. The story of a machine that its own crews at times feared more than the enemy is a tale not so much of metal and engines as of the people who made the decisions, of how a brilliant design, handed over to ambition and stubbornness, turns into a monument to missed opportunities. The folder with this story was long ago tucked into the farthest corner of the archive, and perhaps it is precisely this one that is worth pulling back out from time to time. The folder with this story was pushed into the farthest corner of the archive, and it seems, not by chance. For the Greif is not merely a failed aircraft, it is a mirror in which ambition, stubbornness, and the price of decisions made against all common sense are all reflected. 1,200 machines, dozens of crews lost, factories, metal, fuel, all of it gone into one bottomless pit, for the sake of an aircraft that let down its own side more often than it struck the enemy. And still one uncomfortable question remains. What was this in truth? The blind tyranny of a leadership that refused to admit a mistake? Or a cold calculation, in which engineering sacrifices were counted as an acceptable price for a technological leap? And what do you think? Is the Greif the tragedy of a brilliant design ruined by amateurs in power, or the natural outcome of a system where an order always mattered more than logic? Write your versions in the comments, and do not be afraid to argue. The sharpest analyses are born exactly there, Leave a like if you want more uncomfortable truth. Subscribe and switch on the bell to be the first to reach the closed pages of military history, the very files someone was very keen to leave in the shadows.